What if I told you an entire family vanished during 4th of July celebrations, only to reappear 8 years later with memories that shouldn't exist? Today, I'm taking you inside the Evans case, a mystery that still haunts investigators and challenges everything we thought we knew about missing persons. The Evans family disappeared from their lakeside cabin on July 4th, 1994. No trace, no clues, just gone. But 8 years later, they walked back into town like nothing happened, claiming they'd only been gone for 3 days. The problem: they hadn't aged a single day. Before we dive into this mind-bending case, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Trust me, you won't want to miss where this story goes. Now, let me take you back to that summer of 1994. I've spent 15 years investigating unexplained disappearances across 3 states, but nothing in my career prepared me for the Evans family case. It started as what appeared to be a routine missing persons investigation on a quiet holiday weekend, and ended up challenging everything I thought I knew about the nature of reality itself. The more I dug into this case, the more questions arose and the fewer answers I found. Even now, years later, I find myself lying awake at night wondering about the implications of what the Evans family experienced. July 4th, 1994, Independence Day. While most American families were celebrating with backyard barbecues, fireworks, and parades, the Evans family had chosen to spend their holiday weekend in complete isolation. David, Sarah, and their 12-year-old daughter Emma had rented a secluded lakeside cabin in the heart of the Adirondack Mountains for what should have been a perfect 3-day escape from their busy lives in Albany. This wasn't their first family vacation, but according to friends and relatives, they'd been particularly excited about this trip for months. David Evans was a 38-year-old architect with a successful practice in downtown Albany. Colleagues described him as methodical, practical, and someone who never took unnecessary risks. He'd served in the Army Corps of Engineers in his 20s and had developed a reputation for careful planning and attention to detail. Sarah, 35, taught 4th grade at Lincoln Elementary School and was beloved by both students and parents for her patient, nurturing approach to education. She was the type of person who always carried a first aid kit and made lists for everything, including family vacations. Their daughter Emma was bright, curious, and mature beyond her 12 years. Teachers consistently praised her academic performance and creative writing abilities. She had a habit of documenting everything in detailed journals, filling notebook after notebook with observations about daily life, family trips, and her dreams for the future. Emma was also an avid photographer, having received her first camera for her 11th birthday, and she rarely went anywhere without it hanging around her neck. The cabin they'd rented belonged to the Morrison family, who'd owned the property for 3 generations. It sat on the eastern shore of Mirror Lake, a pristine body of water surrounded by dense pine and maple forest. The lake got its name from the way its perfectly still surface reflected the surrounding mountains and sky like a giant mirror. The cabin was accessible only by a narrow, winding dirt road that snaked through the forest for nearly 2 miles before reaching the property. The nearest neighbor was over 2 miles away, in the opposite direction, making it the perfect location for a family seeking complete privacy and tranquility. Tom Morrison, who managed the property rentals for his family, was in his 70s and had been dealing with vacation renters for over 30 years. He prided himself on never having had any serious problems with guests. The cabin was well maintained, comfortable, and completely ordinary. A 2-bedroom structure with a stone fireplace, a wraparound porch, and a private dock extending into the lake. It came equipped with basic amenities, but no telephone, which was exactly what many city families wanted when they came to disconnect from the modern world. I remember speaking with Tom Morrison when I first took this case 6 months after the family's disappearance. He was sitting in his weathered rocking chair on his own front porch, his weathered hands shaking slightly as he handed me the rental agreement David Evans had signed. "Nice family," he told me, his voice carrying the weight of years spent wondering what had gone wrong. David called on July 3rd to confirm the weekend pickup time and ask about fishing conditions on the lake. Said they were all looking forward to getting away from the city noise and spending quality time together. Nothing unusual about them at all. They seemed like any other family excited about a weekend retreat. The Evans family arrived at the cabin on Friday evening, July 1st, just as the sun was beginning to set behind the western mountains. Tom Morrison met them at the property to hand over the keys and give them a brief tour of the facilities. Everything seemed perfectly normal during this initial encounter. David carried their luggage from the car, while Sarah stood on the porch admiring the spectacular view of the lake bathed in golden evening light. Emma immediately ran to the water's edge, fascinated by the way the last rays of sunlight danced on the surface like scattered diamonds. Tom remembered Emma asking detailed questions about the fish in the lake, whether they glowed in the dark like fireflies, and if the Native Americans who once lived in the area had any legends about the water. She was the kind of child who noticed everything and wanted to understand the world around her. Sarah called to her daughter to be careful near the water's edge, but she was smiling as she said it, clearly delighted by Emma's enthusiasm for their new surroundings. They spent that Friday evening settling into the cabin and planning their weekend activities. David mentioned to Tom that they intended to spend Saturday hiking some of the forest trails, Sunday fishing from the dock, and Monday, their departure day, just relaxing and soaking up the peaceful atmosphere before returning to their hectic city life. Sarah had packed enough food for the entire weekend, wanting to minimize trips to the small town 15 minutes away. She'd brought Emma's favorite snacks, ingredients for s'mores around the campfire, and everything needed for hearty outdoor meals. Saturday, July the 2nd, dawned clear and warm with just a hint of mist rising from the lake's surface. According to Tom Morrison, who checked on the property from a distance that morning during his daily rounds, everything appeared normal. He could see the family moving around the cabin, apparently preparing for their planned hiking adventure. Smoke rose from the chimney, suggesting they'd built a fire for breakfast, and he could hear the distant sound of laughter carrying across the water. Local fisherman Joe Hartley had his first and only significant interaction with the Evans family that Saturday morning around 10 a.m. He was trolling along the eastern shore when he spotted them preparing to head into the forest for their hike. David was adjusting his backpack straps while Sarah double-checked their supplies. Emma was sitting on the dock with her feet dangling in the water, her camera around her neck and her ever-present journal in her lap. "Beautiful morning for a hike," Joe called out from his boat, and David waved back enthusiastically. "Sure is," David replied. "My daughter's excited to explore those old trails back in the hills." Emma looked up from her journal and called out, "Have you ever seen any wildlife back there, bears or deer?" Joe chuckled and told her to keep her eyes open for white-tailed deer, especially near the stream that ran through the valley behind the cabin. "They come down to drink in the early morning and late afternoon," he said. Emma made a note in her journal, clearly planning to watch for them. Sunday, July 3rd, passed quietly. Tom Morrison drove by the property once that day and saw no signs of distress or unusual activity. The family's car was parked in its usual spot beside the cabin. Towels hung on the porch railing, suggesting they'd been swimming. The American flag David had hung from the porch on Friday was still flying proudly in preparation for the next day's Independence Day celebration. Everything seemed perfectly normal for a family enjoying a peaceful weekend retreat. Joe Hartley had his final sighting of the Evans family on Sunday morning around 9 a.m. He was fishing near the dock when he saw them having breakfast on the cabin's front porch. The scene was so perfectly ordinary that it burned itself into his memory. David was reading what appeared to be a paperback novel while sipping coffee from a blue ceramic mug. Sarah was braiding Emma's hair while the girl ate what looked like pancakes. Emma was animated, apparently telling her mother about something she'd seen or experienced, gesturing excitedly with her fork. "Looks like you folks are having a great vacation," Joe called out, and they all waved back with genuine smiles. Emma called out, "We're going to explore more trails today. Mom says we might see beavers." It was such an innocent, happy moment that Joe later told investigators it haunted him. "They looked like the perfect American family," he said. "Relaxed, happy, enjoying each other's company. There wasn't the slightest hint that anything was wrong or about to go wrong." Then came July 4th, 1994. Independence Day arrived with clear skies and warm temperatures, perfect weather for hiking, swimming, or any outdoor activity a family might want to enjoy. Tom Morrison had planned to stop by the cabin that evening around 7 p.m. to wish the Evans family a happy holiday and perhaps invite them to drive into town to watch the fireworks display that was scheduled to begin at dusk. It was a tradition he maintained with all his holiday weekend renters, a gesture of small-town hospitality that his guests always appreciated. Tom Morrison drove up the familiar dirt road at exactly 7:15 p.m., the setting sun filtering through the pine trees and casting long shadows across the forest floor. He was looking forward to seeing how the Evans family had enjoyed their weekend and whether they might be interested in renting the cabin again in the future. As he rounded the final bend and the cabin came into view, his first thought was that the family must be inside, preparing for the evening's festivities. But when he parked his truck and called out a greeting, no one answered. The silence was profound and somehow wrong. Tom walked up to the front door and knocked, calling out, "Hello, Evans family! Tom Morrison here!" Still no response. He tried the door handle and found it unlocked, which was normal for the area, but added to his growing sense of unease as he stepped inside. What Tom Morrison found inside that cabin on the evening of July 4th, 1994, was a scene that defied rational explanation. The cabin was empty, but not in the way you'd expect if a family had simply packed up and left for the day. Instead, it looked as though the Evans family had simply vanished in the middle of their normal holiday activities, as if they'd been going about their business one moment and had simply ceased to exist the next. In the kitchen, breakfast dishes sat on the wooden table, still containing half-eaten food. 2 pieces of toast with butter and jam sat on plates, each with just 1 or 2 bites taken. A bowl of cereal had turned soggy, the milk forming a ring around the edge where it had been sitting for hours. Coffee in 2 mugs, 1 blue, 1 white with red stripes, had grown cold. But when Tom touched the coffee pot on the stove, it was still slightly warm to the touch, suggesting it had been brewed relatively recently. Emma's journal lay open on the porch table, a pencil beside it, as if she'd just set it down to go grab something from inside. The last entry, written in her careful 12-year-old handwriting, was dated July 4th and timed at 8:15 a.m. It read, "Day 4 of vacation. Dad says we're going to explore the big trail behind the cabin today, the one that goes way up into the hills. Mum packed sandwiches and lemonade. She also brought the first aid kit because Dad says the trail might be rough in some places. The lake is so pretty in the morning light. I wish we could stay here forever. I'm going to take lots of pictures of whatever we find up there." What disturbed Tom Morrison most was the scene in the living room. Board games were set up on the rustic coffee table, Monopoly, with game pieces scattered across the board as if a game had been interrupted mid-turn. The dice showed a 6 and a 4. And the top card from the chance pile had been turned over but not yet read. Sarah's reading glasses sat folded on top of an open paperback novel, the bookmark hanging loose as if she'd intended to mark her place but had been distracted. David's hiking boots were positioned by the front door, laces loosened as if he'd been about to put them on. Tom Morrison called the sheriff's department immediately, his hands shaking as he dialed the number from the payphone at the general store in town. Deputy Sheriff Catherine Walsh was the first to respond, arriving at the cabin within 30 minutes of Tom's call. Catherine had been with the department for 8 years and had handled her share of missing persons cases, but something about the Evans scene struck her as fundamentally different and disturbing. In her official report, filed later that evening, Catherine noted that all of the family's belongings were still in the cabin. Clothes hung neatly in the bedroom closets, toiletries were arranged on the bathroom counter. David's wallet sat on the bedroom nightstand, containing $340 in cash, 3 credit cards, and his driver's license. Sarah's purse was on the kitchen counter with her identification and $89 in bills. Emma's new camera was on the porch table next to her journal, the film counter showing she'd taken 16 pictures during their stay. The family's 1991 Honda Accord was parked in its usual spot beside the cabin, keys sitting on the kitchen counter where David apparently left them each morning. The car showed no signs of tampering or forced entry. A quick inspection revealed that the trunk contained their packed suitcases, as if they'd planned to load the car after their Monday morning hiking adventure and then drive back to Albany. Catherine Walsh immediately called for backup and began coordinating what would become one of the most extensive search and rescue operations in the region's history. The initial search began that very evening, with local volunteers, sheriff's deputies, and even some off-duty state police officers joining the effort. They used powerful flashlights and called out the family's names, their voices echoing across Mirror Lake and into the dark forest beyond. The search continued through the night and into the next day. Bloodhounds were brought in from the State Police K-9 unit to track the family's scent. The dogs picked up the trail easily enough around the cabin and followed it toward the forest behind the property, but consistently lost the scent at the same location, approximately 200 yards into the woods, near a small clearing where several hiking trails converged. It was as if the Evans family had simply evaporated at that spot. By July 6th, the search had expanded dramatically. Professional search and rescue teams arrived from 3 neighboring counties. Divers were brought in to search Mirror Lake thoroughly, despite the fact that none of the family's clothing or personal effects had been found near the water. The lake wasn't particularly deep, with a maximum depth of about 45 feet, and the water was clear enough in most areas to see the bottom, even without diving equipment. The divers spent 2 full days searching every inch of Mirror Lake's bottom. They found the usual debris you'd expect in any mountain lake: fallen trees, old fishing equipment, even a few pieces of camping gear that had been lost by previous visitors over the years. But they found absolutely nothing belonging to the Evans family. No clothing, no personal effects, no sign that any of them had ever entered the water. Helicopter search teams flew grid patterns over hundreds of square miles of Adirondack wilderness. The pilots used both visual scanning and infrared technology to look for any sign of the missing family. They searched ravines, dense forest areas, abandoned structures, and every hiking trail within a 15-mile radius of Mirror Lake. The aerial search revealed no trace of David, Sarah, or Emma Evans. By July 10th, the case had attracted the attention of Detective Mike Reeves from the New York State Police Bureau of Criminal Investigation. Mike was a 20-year veteran of law enforcement with a reputation for solving difficult cases through methodical investigation and attention to detail. He'd handled dozens of missing persons cases throughout his career, but he later told me that the Evans disappearance was unlike anything he'd ever encountered. Mike arrived at the cabin with a team of forensic specialists and crime scene technicians, determined to find some piece of evidence that the initial search teams might have overlooked. They processed every inch of the property with meticulous care, dusting for fingerprints, testing for blood evidence, photographing every detail, and collecting samples of anything that might provide clues about what had happened to the family. The forensic team found abundant evidence that the Evans family had been living in the cabin during their stay. Their fingerprints were everywhere, on dishes, door handles, furniture, and personal belongings. DNA evidence recovered from the bathroom confirmed that all 3 family members had been present and using the facilities normally. Food in the refrigerator included items the family had purchased, some of which showed bite marks that could be matched to dental records if necessary. But despite this thorough forensic examination, investigators found absolutely no evidence that anyone else had been at the cabin during the Evans family's stay. There were no unidentified fingerprints, no signs of forced entry, no indication of a struggle, and no evidence that any other person had set foot on the property. Whatever had happened to David, Sarah, and Emma Evans, they had apparently been completely alone when it occurred. Mike Reeves spent the following weeks interviewing everyone who might have had any contact with the Evans family during their stay in the area. The general store owner, Jim Patterson, remembered David stopping by on July 2nd to purchase ice, fishing line, and a local newspaper. He seemed completely relaxed, Jim told investigators. We talked about the weather, the fishing conditions on Mirror Lake, and he mentioned how excited his daughter was about exploring the hiking trails. Nothing in his demeanor suggested any kind of worry or distress. The owner of Morrison's bait and tackle shop, Betty Chen, remembered Sarah coming in on July 3rd to purchase a fishing license and ask questions about the best spots on Mirror Lake for catching bass and trout. She was very friendly and seemed genuinely interested in learning about fishing, Betty recalled. She mentioned that her husband was going to teach their daughter how to cast properly, and she wanted to surprise them by actually knowing something about fish when they went out on the water. Mike Reeves expanded his investigation to examine every aspect of the Evans family's life back in Albany. Were there financial problems that might have prompted them to disappear voluntarily? Marriage difficulties that weren't apparent to friends and colleagues? Any indication that they might have been planning to start new lives somewhere else? The financial investigation revealed nothing suspicious. David's architectural firm, Evans and Associates, was thriving. He'd recently landed several major commercial projects and had a healthy business account with no unusual withdrawals or transfers. The family's personal finances were solid. They had modest savings, no significant debts beyond their mortgage, and no large cash withdrawals that might suggest they were preparing to disappear. David's business partner, Michael Rodriguez, told investigators that David had been excited about the lakeside vacation and had specifically mentioned looking forward to having uninterrupted time with his family. He'd been working long hours on the Westfield Mall project, Michael explained. The vacation was his way of making up for lost time with Sarah and Emma. He was planning to propose a family trip to Europe for the following summer. Sarah's principal at Lincoln Elementary, Dr. Margaret Foster, described her as one of the most dedicated and beloved teachers in the school. Sarah would never just abandon her students, Dr. Foster insisted. She was already planning her curriculum for the upcoming school year and had submitted proposals for 2 new after-school programs. Her entire life revolved around teaching and her family. The investigation into Emma's life revealed a bright, well-adjusted child with no apparent problems. Her 6th-grade teacher, Mrs. Helen Carter, described Emma as creative, inquisitive, and mature for her age. She was always writing stories and taking pictures, Mrs. Carter remembered. She'd told the class about the lakeside vacation and was excited about documenting everything in her journal. Emma was the kind of child who found wonder in everyday experiences. Friends and extended family members were unanimous in their assessment that the Evans family had been happy, stable, and completely normal. David's brother Robert, who lived in Buffalo, told investigators that David had called him the week before the trip to share his excitement about the vacation. David said they were all looking forward to getting away from the city and spending uninterrupted time together as a family, Robert recalled. There wasn't the slightest hint of any problems. Sarah's sister Michelle, a nurse living in Syracuse, had spoken with Sarah just 3 days before the family left for Mirror Lake. Sarah was like a kid herself, talking about all the activities they had planned, Michelle told investigators. She'd bought Emma a new camera specifically for the trip and had been reading books about Adirondack wildlife so she could help identify birds and plants they might encounter. She was completely focused on making sure Emma had the perfect vacation experience. As the days turned into weeks with no new leads or evidence, the Evans case began to attract media attention beyond the local area. The story of an entire family vanishing without a trace from an isolated cabin captured the public imagination in a way that single missing person cases rarely did. Local newspapers began running daily updates under headlines like "Mirror Lake Mystery Deepens" and "Search Continues for Vanished Family." Regional television stations sent news crews to cover the story, and soon the small town near Mirror Lake was dealing with an influx of reporters, camera crews, and curious onlookers drawn by the mystery. The media attention brought additional volunteers for search efforts, but it also created complications for the investigation. Well-meaning but untrained civilians began conducting their own searches of the area, sometimes contaminating potential evidence sites or getting lost themselves and requiring rescue. The case also attracted the attention of psychics, self-proclaimed paranormal investigators, and conspiracy theorists. The sheriff's department received hundreds of phone calls from people claiming to have had visions of where the family might be found. Psychics arrived from across the country, offering to help locate the missing family through supernatural means. While law enforcement maintained professional courtesy with these individuals, none of their predictions or guidance led to any useful discoveries. Mike Reeves found himself working 18-hour days, consumed by the mystery of what had happened to the Evans family. He returned to the cabin repeatedly, sometimes alone, walking through the rooms and sitting on the porch where the family had spent their final confirmed moments. He studied every detail of Emma's journal, looking for any subtle hint of premonition or concern that might provide insight into their fate. The final entry in Emma's journal became particularly significant to the investigation. Written on the morning of July 4th, it read, "Day 4 of vacation. Dad says we're going to explore the big trail behind the cabin today, the one that goes way up into the hills. Mum packed sandwiches and lemonade. She also brought the first aid kit because Dad says the trail might be rough in some places. The lake is so pretty in the morning light. I wish we could stay here forever. I'm going to take lots of pictures of whatever we find up there." The phrase, "I wish we could stay here forever," haunted Mike Reeves. Had Emma somehow prophetically expressed what was about to happen to her family? Was it merely the innocent wish of a child enjoying a perfect vacation, or did it carry some deeper significance that investigators were missing? Mike spent considerable time exploring the hiking trails behind the cabin, trying to determine exactly which route the Evans family might have taken on their final morning. There were several interconnected trails in the area, ranging from easy walks suitable for families to challenging climbs that required experienced hiking skills. Based on David's outdoor experience and the fact that they'd brought Emma along, investigators focused on the moderate trails that would be appropriate for a 12-year-old. The trail system behind the Morrison cabin was well established, maintained by the State Park Service, and used regularly by hikers throughout the summer months. Park rangers confirmed that the trails were clearly marked and that it would be extremely difficult for an experienced outdoorsman like David Evans to become lost, especially on the main routes that formed clear loops back to the starting point. Search teams had thoroughly explored every established trail within a 10-mile radius of the cabin. They'd found no sign that the Evans family had passed through, no footprints in muddy areas, no disturbed vegetation, no dropped personal items. It was as if the family had started out on their hike and had simply vanished before reaching any of the established trail markers. By September 1994, the active search for the Evans family had been officially scaled back, though the case remained open and active. With no new leads and no evidence of foul play, there was simply little more that law enforcement could do with available resources. The cabin was released back to the Morrison family, though Tom Morrison later told me he couldn't bring himself to rent it to other families after what had happened. The empty cabin became a source of local folklore and unwanted attention from curiosity seekers. Despite efforts to keep the location private, word spread about the site where an entire family had mysteriously vanished, and the property began attracting amateur investigators, paranormal enthusiasts, and morbid tourists. Tom Morrison eventually had to post no trespassing signs and increase security around the property. Years passed. The Evans family's house in Albany was eventually sold to cover mortgage payments and property taxes. Their belongings were carefully stored by relatives who maintained hope that David, Sarah, and Emma might someday return to claim them. Emma's school dedicated a memorial tree in the schoolyard in 1996, with a small plaque reading, "In memory of Emma Evans," whose curiosity and joy touched everyone around her. David's architectural firm established the Evans Family Scholarship Fund at the University at Albany's School of Architecture, providing annual financial assistance to students who demonstrated both academic excellence and commitment to family values. Sarah's colleagues at Lincoln Elementary created a reading garden in her honor, knowing how much she had loved encouraging children to explore through books. Mike Reeves retired from the state police in 2000, but the Evans case remained an obsession for him throughout his retirement. He kept complete copies of all case files in his home office, sometimes spending entire evenings reviewing witness statements, evidence reports, and crime scene photographs. He never stopped hoping that some new piece of information would emerge to explain what had happened to the family that had simply vanished from Mirror Lake. The case occasionally resurfaced in true crime forums, paranormal websites, and amateur investigator communities. Theories about what had happened to the Evans family ranged from the logical to the bizarre. Some suggested they had fallen into an unmapped cave system or had been victims of a carefully planned kidnapping. Others proposed more exotic explanations involving UFO abduction, dimensional portals, or supernatural intervention. The lack of physical evidence meant that virtually any theory was as valid as any other, which only added to the mystery's enduring appeal. Without bodies, without signs of struggle, without any indication of where the family might have gone, the Evans disappearance became a blank canvas onto which people could project their own theories about what might be possible in our world. In 2001, the case was featured on a national television program dedicated to unsolved mysteries. The episode generated hundreds of tips and potential leads, but extensive follow-up investigation failed to produce any credible new information. People reported seeing the Evans family in other states, other countries, and even claimed to have encountered them in situations that would have been chronologically impossible. Each reported sighting was carefully investigated and ultimately dismissed. The Evans family had vanished as completely as if they had never existed, leaving behind only their belongings, their interrupted breakfast, and an endless series of questions that seemed to have no answers. Then came July 4th, 2002. Exactly 8 years to the day after David, Sarah, and Emma Evans had disappeared from their lakeside cabin. I was working a completely different case that Independence Day, investigating a series of residential break-ins in Washington County, when my radio crackled to life with a message that made me question my own sanity. The dispatcher's voice was tight, with barely controlled confusion, as she reported that a family matching the exact description of the Evans family had walked into the sheriff's office in the town nearest to Mirror Lake. According to the initial report, they were asking for directions back to their cabin, seemed confused about why everyone was staring at them as if they'd seen ghosts, and appeared to be completely unaware that anything unusual had happened. The dispatcher added that the family insisted it was July 7th, 1994, and that they'd only been away from their cabin for a few hours. I dropped everything and drove to the sheriff's office as fast as legally possible, my mind racing with possibilities and questions. During the 40-minute drive, I tried to prepare myself for what I might find. Was this an elaborate hoax, a case of mistaken identity? Had someone with inside knowledge of the case recruited lookalikes to perpetrate some kind of cruel fraud? When I walked into the sheriff's office waiting area and saw them sitting there, my blood ran cold and my rational mind simply stopped functioning for several seconds. There, sitting on the wooden bench exactly as they had appeared in every photograph from 1994, were David Evans, Sarah Evans, and Emma Evans. Not aged, not weathered by 8 years of unknown experiences, but exactly, precisely the same as they had been on the day they disappeared. David still had the same slightly receding hairline, the same laugh lines around his eyes, even the same small scar on his left hand from a childhood accident. Sarah's hair was still the exact same length and style she'd worn in 1994, and she was wearing the same earrings that had been described in the original missing persons report. Emma was unmistakably still 12 years old, wearing the same clothes she'd had on when she vanished, her camera hanging around her neck just as it had been found on the cabin porch. Officer Jim Foster, who had taken their initial statement, pulled me aside with a look of barely contained panic in his eyes. "Detective," he whispered, "they insist it's July 7th, 1994. They think they've been gone from their cabin for about 4 hours. When I showed them a newspaper with today's date, the man nearly fainted and the woman started crying. The little girl keeps asking why everyone looks so much older." I sat down across from the Evans family in the interview room, studying their faces for any sign that this was some kind of elaborate performance or psychological delusion. David Evans looked confused and slightly irritated, but not panicked. Sarah kept checking her watch repeatedly, as if it might somehow provide an explanation for what was happening. Emma was looking around the room with the curious, slightly impatient expression of a 12-year-old who didn't understand why adults were making such a big deal about nothing. "Mr. Evans," I began carefully, choosing my words as if they were potential explosives, "can you tell me what day you think it is today?" David Evans looked at me as if I'd asked him to explain the most obvious thing in the world. "It's July 7th, 1994. Wednesday. We were supposed to check out of our cabin yesterday, but we got delayed during our hike and decided to stay an extra day. The Morrison fellow said that would be fine when I called him this morning." "Can you tell me about this hike?" "We started early Monday morning," Sarah interjected, her voice steady but with an undercurrent of confusion. "July 4th. We packed lunch and water and decided to explore that big trail behind the cabin, the one that leads up into the hills. Emma had been wanting to see where it went since we arrived." Emma nodded enthusiastically, apparently unaware of the extraordinary nature of what she was about to describe. "It was the most beautiful hike ever. The trail kept going and going, through all these amazing places we'd never seen before. There were flowers that seemed to glow in the shadows, and trees so tall they completely blocked out the sun. The whole forest felt magical, like something from a fairy tale." I pulled out a current calendar and carefully placed it on the table in front of David Evans. As his eyes focused on the date, July 4th, 2002, his face went completely white. His hands began to shake, and he stared at the calendar as if it were written in a foreign language he couldn't comprehend. "That's not possible," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "That's absolutely not possible. We've been gone for a few hours, just a few hours." The medical examination that followed was perhaps the most bizarre and unsettling part of the entire case. Dr. Elizabeth Crawford, the county medical examiner and a physician with over 20 years of experience, performed comprehensive physical examinations on all 3 family members. What she discovered defied every principle of medical science and biological aging that she'd learned throughout her career. According to every available medical test and diagnostic procedure available in 2002, the Evans family had not aged a single day since their disappearance 8 years earlier. Their dental records matched perfectly with their 1994 X-rays, showing no progression in dental wear, no new cavities, no changes in bone density that would be expected after 8 years of normal aging. Carbon dating analysis of hair and fingernail samples indicated that the family had been alive and metabolically active during the entire 8-year period, but showed absolutely no signs of normal biological aging processes. David Evans' wristwatch, a reliable timepiece he'd worn for over 10 years, had stopped at exactly 2:17 p.m. on July 4, 1994. The watch showed no signs of damage or tampering. It had simply stopped functioning at that precise moment and had remained frozen at that time for 8 years. Sarah's daily medication regimen included vitamins and allergy medication that were still present in her bloodstream at exactly the levels you'd expect if she'd taken them that very morning, despite the fact that those medications should have been metabolized and eliminated from her system within hours. Emma's journal contained 3 new entries that hadn't been there when investigators had examined it in 1994. The handwriting was unmistakably hers, matching perfectly with graphology analysis of her previous entries. But the content described places and experiences that seemingly couldn't exist anywhere in the known geography of the Adirondack Mountains. The new entries described their hike in elaborate detail, but the landscape they depicted was unlike anything found in our world. According to Emma's detailed account, written in her careful 12-year-old handwriting, they had followed the familiar trail behind the cabin for about 30 minutes before discovering what appeared to be a continuation of the path that none of them had noticed during previous explorations. This new section of trail was remarkably well maintained and seemed to lead deeper into the mountains than any of the established hiking routes. The new part of the trail was different from the regular paths, Emma had written. It was paved with these smooth stones that looked like they'd been polished by water for thousands of years. The stones seemed to glow slightly, especially in the darker parts of the forest where the trees blocked out most of the sunlight. Dad said he'd never seen anything like it, and Mom kept taking pictures even though she said her camera was acting strange. Sarah's camera, which had been found on the cabin porch in 1994, now contained a full roll of exposed film. When developed, the photographs showed landscapes that were simultaneously beautiful and impossible. Images of forests filled with bioluminescent plants, crystal-clear streams that seemed to flow upward through the air, and architectural structures that appeared to be grown rather than built. The photographs were technically perfect. Proper exposure, sharp focus, accurate color representation, but they depicted scenes that couldn't exist in any earthly location. Time moved differently there, Sarah explained during one of many lengthy interviews. We'd stop to rest and eat lunch, and when we looked around afterward, the sun would still be in exactly the same position in the sky. We'd explore for what felt like hours, taking pictures and marveling at the incredible beauty of everything we saw, then sit down for dinner, only to discover that we weren't actually hungry yet. David's account corroborated Sarah's description of temporal distortion, but added details that were even more disturbing. We met other people during our hike, he told investigators, his voice carrying a mixture of wonder and confusion. Other families who were also exploring the trails. But they were from different time periods. We talked with a family who said they were from 1967, and they looked exactly like people from that era. Their clothes, their hairstyles, even the way they spoke. Their children were still the same ages they'd been when they started their hike, even though they said they'd been walking for what felt like years. The psychiatric evaluations conducted on all 3 family members were equally puzzling and unprecedented. Dr. Michael Torres, a forensic psychiatrist with extensive experience in cases involving memory loss and psychological trauma, found no evidence of mental illness, delusional thinking, or deliberate deception in any of the Evans family members. All 3 passed comprehensive psychological assessments with completely normal results. Polygraph examinations confirmed that David, Sarah, and Emma Evans genuinely believed every detail of their account. They showed no physiological indicators of deception when describing their experience, and their emotional responses were completely consistent with people recounting actual memories rather than fabricated stories. Whatever they had experienced during those missing 8 years, they remembered it exactly as they described it. Perhaps most unsettling of all was the complete absence of any memories from the 8-year period between 1994 and 2002. When asked about major world events that had occurred during their absence, natural disasters, political changes, technological developments, the family showed no knowledge or awareness whatsoever. Their last clear memories were of beginning their hike on July 4th, 1994, and their next conscious awareness was of completing that same hike on what they believed to be July 7th, 1994. I spent the following months conducting the most thorough investigation of my career, trying to find some rational explanation for what had happened to the Evans family. I returned to the area behind the Morrison cabin dozens of times, searching for any trace of the trail they described, the magical landscape they claimed to have encountered, or any physical evidence that might support their account. I found several well-maintained hiking trails in the area, but none matched the family's description of the stone-paved path that had led them into their impossible experience. Park rangers and forestry officials confirmed that no such trail existed anywhere in the region. Geological surveys of the entire area revealed no unusual mineral formations, underground caverns, or topographical features that might create the kind of environment the Evans family described. Yet the physical evidence of their unchanged appearance was undeniable and inexplicable. 3 people had vanished completely for 8 years, then returned in precisely the same physical condition as when they disappeared. Medical science had no explanation for how this could be possible. The normal processes of cellular aging, metabolism, and biological change had somehow been suspended for an entire family. The case generated intense international attention when news of the Evans family's return was leaked to the media. Scientists, theologians, physicologists, and paranormal investigators from around the world descended on the small town near Mirror Lake, all seeking answers to questions that seemed to transcend the boundaries of known science and human understanding. The Evans family found themselves at the center of a media circus they couldn't comprehend, thrust into a world that had moved forward 8 years without them. Technology had advanced, political landscapes had shifted, popular culture had evolved, friends and relatives had aged, while they remained frozen in time. They were famous for an experience they couldn't fully explain and didn't entirely understand themselves. What troubled me most deeply was the expression I saw in their eyes when they spoke about their experience in that otherworldly landscape. There was something there, a knowledge or understanding that they couldn't quite articulate with ordinary language. Emma, especially, seemed to carry secrets and insights that her 12-year-old vocabulary simply couldn't express. When she talked about the places they'd visited and the people they'd met, her eyes held a depth of experience that seemed impossible for someone her age. Emma's artwork, created during the weeks following their return, depicted fantastic scenes of the landscape they claimed to have encountered. Her drawings showed forests of impossible geometry, where trees grew in spirals and flowers bloomed in colors that don't exist in our visual spectrum. She drew architectural structures that seemed to be alive, growing and changing rather than built from static materials. Her sketches depicted other families they'd encountered, people from different historical periods, all existing simultaneously in a place outside of normal time. The Evans family eventually made the difficult decision to relocate to another state, seeking privacy and anonymity in hopes of rebuilding their lives in a world that had fundamentally changed during their absence. David's architectural firm had closed years earlier, dissolved when he failed to return from his vacation. Sarah's teaching position at Lincoln Elementary had long been filled by someone else. Emma faced the unprecedented challenge of returning to school as a 12-year-old in a world that expected her to be 20 years old. Their house in Albany had been sold to cover mortgage payments and property taxes. Their friends had moved on, aged, and built new lives. The world of 1994 that they remembered as yesterday had been replaced by the reality of 2002, a reality they had to learn about and adapt to as if they were travelers from another time. In my final official report on the Evans case, filed with the New York State Police and the FBI, I wrote, "The Evans family disappearance and return represents a phenomenon that currently exists beyond the boundaries of scientific understanding and criminal investigation protocols." While the family's account of their experience cannot be verified through conventional investigative means, neither can it be disproven or explained through any known natural or human-caused mechanisms. The physical evidence of their unchanged appearance and the consistency of their testimony suggest an experience that operates outside normal parameters of space, time, and physical reality. But that carefully worded official language failed to capture the true mystery and profound implications of what had happened to David, Sarah, and Emma Evans. Late at night, when I sit in my study reviewing the case files and examining Emma's drawings of impossible landscapes, I find myself questioning fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality itself. If time could stop for one family, if 8 years could pass in the subjective space of 3 days, if people could somehow step outside the normal flow of existence and return unchanged, then what other impossibilities might be hiding in the spaces between our understanding? The trail behind the Morrison cabin still exists, still winds its way up into the Adirondack Mountains, just as it did in 1994. I've walked that trail more times than I can count, always hoping to find some evidence of the magical landscape the Evans family described, some hint of the doorway they claimed to have discovered. Sometimes, in the early morning hours when mist rises from Mirror Lake and the forest is absolutely silent, I think I catch glimpses of something extraordinary just beyond the edge of vision, a hint of light that shouldn't be there. A suggestion of a path leading somewhere that doesn't appear on any map. The Evans family's story challenges everything we think we know about missing persons cases, about the nature of time and space, about the fundamental structure of reality itself. They vanished completely for 8 years, existing somewhere outside our normal world, then returned unchanged and carrying memories of experiences that shouldn't be possible according to every scientific principle we understand. Their case remains officially classified as unexplained phenomena, filed in a folder that grows thicker each year as similar cases emerge from around the world. Reports of families, individuals, and groups who disappear from isolated locations only to return days, months, or years later with accounts of experiences in places that don't exist on our maps or in our understanding of the possible. What really happened to the Evans family during those missing 8 years? Did they somehow discover a doorway leading to a place where different rules apply, where time moves differently, where the impossible becomes everyday reality? Are there locations in our world, hidden trails, forgotten paths, doorways disguised as ordinary landscape features that lead to somewhere else entirely, places where families can disappear for decades and return unchanged by the passage of time? The answers to these questions remain as elusive and mysterious as the trail the Evans family claims to have followed on that July morning in 1994. But their story stands as a reminder that our world may contain wonders and impossibilities that we've barely begun to understand. Places where the boundaries between reality and dreams become fluid, and where families can walk through doorways into forever. What do you think really happened to the Evans family? Did they find a doorway to somewhere beyond our understanding, or is there a rational explanation we haven't considered? Share your theories in the comments below.